Good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to this morning's webinar on the government reforms to the rental sector. This webinar has been hosted by the PSRA in conjunction with the RTB. So the first thing I'd like to do is thank the RTB for facilitating this webinar for our licensees, for the PSRA's licensees. My name is Marion O'Reilly. I'm Head of Development and Communications in the PSRA, and I'm joined by Sinead Murphy, Head of Communications in the RTB, along with Gary Byrne, an Authorised Officer on the RTB's Compliance and Enforcement team. And also, Connor Hayes is joining us, Communications and Engagement Manager in the RTB. This is the second webinar that we've hosted with the RTB since the introduction of the changes to the Residential Tenancies Act. And both webinars have attracted a huge level of interest from our licensees. And it just reflects, I suppose, the importance of this piece of legislation, how it's impacting letting agents particularly. And, it's great to see that level of engagement from our licensees. So thank you all for joining us. I will shortly be handing you over to Gary, who will present. And just to make you aware, we will run a short Q&A session with the guys when the presentation is finished. And I know from the previous webinar, Gary's presentation will be very informative. I know you might have a lot of questions now. A lot of those questions may be answered by the time Gary's finished talking. But if there is anything that you want to clarify or something you didn't catch, do pop your questions into the chat and we will try and get to them at the end if we can. So I think, Gary, if you're ready, I'll hand you over. Um, I'll just.
Great, thanks, Marion. I'll just try and share my screen now, and then
Sure, if I have. Oh, I haven't stopped sharing yet. Okay.
just bear with me for a moment. So hopefully the presentation's starting to come up now. So you might just let me know, is the opening page there visible to everyone?
Yeah, Gary, I can see it there anyway. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Okay, thanks for inviting us and welcome everyone. As Marion mentioned, yeah, my name's Gary Byrne and I've with the RTB for a number of years now in different departments in our disputes team and now in our compliance and enforcement team. And some of you may have attended the earlier sessions, so apologies for any duplication and hopefully you still find this useful. So I'm going to provide an overview of the changes to legislation that commenced on the 1st of March this year, with a focus on how tenancies can end and the changes to tenancy termination, and also the changes in terms of setting and reviewing rents and the new system that's in place with regard to rent setting. So just to say initially at a very high level, the new rules that commence on the 1st of March collectively can have been said to have introduced some stronger protections in terms of tenancy durations, and I'll run through them in a little bit more detail in a moment. The rules have changed obviously in how and when a landlord can terminate a tenancy, and we have a new system of rent control which has replaced the rent pressure zones. And again, I'll go into all this in more detail shortly. And apologies for the repetition, but we are just keen to emphasise that these rules apply to tenancies that have been created on or after the 1st of March, and that obviously there was a large volume of tenancies in existence on the 28th of February this year. And these rules that I'm running through now do not affect those tenancies that were in situ prior to the 1st of March. And I'll kind of explain how that works in practice as we move along. Again, at the top, just to mention one amendment that commenced on the 1st of March was the introduction of this idea of a tenancy of minimum duration. And I suppose this is the Residential Tenancies Act has always provided for security of tenure, what people probably know as Part 4 tenancies. This is additional protections that a tenant gets to remain in their rented accommodation under certain conditions. And those conditions primarily are that they've lived in the property for 6 months or more continuously, and that during that initial 6 months of a tenancy, a landlord hasn't served a valid notice of termination. And after that period of time, a tenant gets some additional rights and protections. And for tenancies from the 1st of March onwards, the nature of that protection is deemed to be a tenancy of minimum duration, which may last for 6 years. Again, I'll explain as we move along how that impacts the idea of setting rent or ending a tenancy. So that idea of tenancy of minimum duration is a new, I suppose it's a slight tweak on an existing concept, the idea of security within a rented property after 6 months. In terms of ending a tenancy and serving a notice of termination, which will probably be crucial for yourselves and a lot of the landlords you're working with. Landlords can still end a tenancy within the first 6 months of a tenancy. There's been no change in terms of that element of it without requiring any particular ground. The grounds people will be familiar with, things like selling a property or carrying out a substantial refurbishment, etc. Those pre-existing grounds. The asterisk is just to indicate, and again, the law hasn't changed in this regard, but it's just something we flag as a reminder to everyone that people obviously need to be conscious of the presence of any fixed term lease agreement that might be in place. A written lease agreement is very common, particularly at the start of a new tenancy. It is optional. And if a lease is entered into, it could be for a periodic or a rolling period of time, or traditionally it is often for 1 year or a fixed period. Again, there may be terms written into that lease that may allow for early termination, what people may know as a break clause. But generally speaking, if a lease is entered into and it's for a fixed period and there is no break clause, that lease should be honoured by both sides unless there's a breach of obligations. So that needs to be borne in mind in terms of tenancy termination as well. Is there a lease? Is it for a fixed period? Is there a break clause? They're all just things to consider before any notice of termination is served. Nothing has changed in that regard. That's just by way of reminder. After a tenancy has been in place for 6 months or more, as I mentioned earlier, a landlord can still end a tenancy, but the grounds are prescribed in legislation, and then the landlord for tenancies from the 1st of March onwards does need to consider a couple of different factors. Is whether the tenancy was pre or post the 1st of March, and whether that landlord is deemed to be a smaller or a larger landlord under the new legislation, which is about number of tenancies, and I will come on to that as well. Just to say up front, and I will talk a little bit about market rent resets shortly, and people may have heard of this idea of being allowed to set rent to market again in between tenancies. If a landlord avails of the option to end a tenancy within that first 6 months, as they may be able to do, they cannot reset rent to market for the subsequent tenancy. So whether or not you can reset rent to market for the next tenancy following on is linked directly to how that previous tenancy was ended. And it doesn't include ending a tenancy within the first 6 months without requiring a reason. And I will come on shortly to outlining when a landlord can reset rent to a market rate. So from the 1st of March this year, if a tenancy has commenced, a landlord can end a tenancy, and this is without reference or consideration of whether they're deemed to be a smaller or a larger landlord. These two initial reasons are applicable to both categories of landlord, if you like, and that is if a tenant has breached their obligations. So that's a universal, if you like. That's always been the case, and it remains the case. If a tenant is in breach of their tenancy obligations, a tenancy can be ended, regardless of, for example, the presence of any fixed term lease, but assuming the process is followed correctly in terms of warning letters and valid notice of termination, etc. And a smaller or a larger landlord, if you like, can also end a tenancy if the dwelling is deemed no longer suitable to the accommodation needs of that tenant. And that's with reference to the number of bed spaces in the dwelling. That's an existing ground for termination. People may be familiar with it. So you're looking at, the occupied household, the nature and composition of the household, and has it changed, and the number of bed spaces in the dwelling. Those reasons are available to all categories or types of landlord. Outside of those two reasons, then you're really considering whether or not the landlord is deemed smaller or larger. And a landlord with 1 to 3 tenancies is categorized as a smaller landlord, and a landlord with 4+ tenancies, or a company landlord, is categorized as a larger landlord. 2 points just to emphasize here. This designation is at a point in time. It's at the point of time of service of a notice of termination. So this could fluctuate, as you can imagine, depending on what happens with tenancies. A landlord may sell a dwelling, or a tenancy may end, etc. So it's really at that point a notice being served is when this needs to be considered. And it may be obvious, but just to emphasize, company landlords, it's an across-the-board designation, and that's regardless of the number of tenancies they may have. For example, if they've 1, 2, or 5 tenancies, a company landlord is categorized as a large landlord under this legislation. So how can a landlord end a tenancy if they're deemed to be a smaller landlord? Well, if it's during this 6-year tenancy cycle, I mentioned this tenancy of minimum duration. We have those 2 earlier reasons I mentioned, the breach of tenant obligations, the dwelling no longer being suitable to the accommodation needs of the tenant. And alongside that, there are the other grounds for termination that people may be familiar with, but they're limited in some respects. So during this 6-year tenancy cycle, a smaller landlord could sell the dwelling, can end a tenancy to sell the dwelling, but only to avoid undue financial or other hardship. And that's prescribed in the legislation as to what that specifically references in terms of bankruptcy or a debt settlement or discharging a debt, etc. There's clear criteria in the legislation to meet that. Or if a landlord or a close needs to move into the dwelling themselves, or a close family member needs to live in the dwelling, the tenancy could be ended. At the end of the 6-year tenancy cycle, this would arise the earliest being in 2032. The other grounds for termination that you'll be aware of, they open back up, as it were, for the landlord to potentially end the tenancy. If the landlord or a family member needs to move into the property, and it's a wider definition of family member at that point in time, to sell the dwelling, but there doesn't need to have been any undue financial hardship. It's the more general sale ground, to substantially refurbish or renovate, or to change the use of the dwelling. Larger landlords and company landlords are more restricted, and they're restricted to those 2 grounds I mentioned earlier, the tenant being in breach of their obligations, or the dwelling no longer being suitable to the accommodation needs of the tenants. Obviously, a tenant may choose to terminate a tenancy, but aside from that, the 2 reasons above are really the only reasons a larger landlord could end a tenancy, and that's both during the 6-year tenancy cycle and at the end of the 6-year tenancy cycle. For tenancies that are in place prior to the 1st of March this year, existing tenancies in place on the 28th of February or earlier, they're operating under, if you like, the old set of rules for tenancy termination. So there's no consideration needed for whether the landlord is deemed smaller or smaller or larger. The grounds for termination are applicable across the board and are the grounds you'll be familiar with, and that were I ran through in the earlier slide. It's just a more generally available throughout the tenancy to all categories of landlord. One other thing to be aware of, I won't dwell on it because there's not too many of these tenancies probably still in place, but if a tenancy is a long-running tenancy and it's in place prior to June 2022, a landlord could end a tenancy for one additional reason, and that is as they come to the end of a Part 4 or a further Part 4 tenancy cycle, the end of a 6-year period. Prior to that date and time, there was an option for a landlord to end a tenancy without requiring any ground for termination as they reached the end of that tenancy cycle. And if you're have a tenancy in place prior to this date, you're still entitled to avail of that option. All tenancies that are in place prior to June 2022 will transition over time, and that option will no longer be available, but it still is there as a potential for possibly a small enough cohort of tenancies. Another point to reference in terms of tenancy termination and documents generally is that there has been a change since the 1st of March around the services of notices under the Act, and it's the introduction of electronic service. So this is now provided for under Section 6 of the Act. Notices and documents can be served electronically by email, fax, or another electronic contact point used by the person. There does need to be a record that the notice or document is sent, not necessarily received, but sent. And we're advising people to take a precautionary approach, particularly for existing tenancies. It is obviously a big help to people. It's a more modern way of perhaps communicating between parties, but on a practical level, if two sides have never communicated by email previously and you're serving a very important document, you may wish to retain the old methods of delivery by hand or posts, etc. But as long as both parties are clear on what the communication methods will be going forward and stay in touch, there shouldn't be any difficulties. It's something you may want to build into tenancy agreements at the start of a tenancy and confirm contact details periodically to ensure they're up to date and they're accurate, etc., just to avoid any confusion or any potential difficulty at a later point in time. In terms of same-day service, we have some updated guidance in this area. It may not be, if you weren't aware of it to begin with, it may not be updated, but landlords are required now to serve certain documents to the RTB. We'll come on to this in more detail. Notices of rent review, notices of rent setting, and notices of termination. And there is a requirement that the notice is served to the RTB and the tenant on the same day. And this is really on foot of a High Court decision that was reached relatively recently. And it's important that the document is served to the RTB and the tenant on the same day. So if you're posting the document, that could present a challenge or potentially just, I suppose, create an element of doubt as to whether the document was received by the RTB and the tenant on the same day. So what we're advising is the best option would be to serve the notices to the RTB via our new service centre, which I'm going to show you shortly, if at all possible. You may be familiar with this dispute resolution centre. It's been available for a while for submission of disputes, and now notices and documents can be uploaded through this portal as well. So if, for example, you're serving a document to us via that and emailing it to the tenant on the same day, that would be effective. If you're hand delivering to the tenant, of course, there wouldn't be an issue, and then you're uploading the document to the RTB on the same day. If you're leaving it at the address in person and sending it to the RTB through the service centre, sending notices by post to the tenant and to the RTB isn't recommended currently, because again, it just creates this element of doubt that they won't be received on the same day, which on foot of this High Court decision seems to be the key factor. So in terms of best practice and ensuring, landlords protect themselves fully, we do strongly encourage people to use our electronic method, the service centre. And as I said, I will demo that. We can go back to this if there's questions as well later. I'm just going to move on to the rent side of things. And sorry, Bert, I'm just keeping an eye on the timings as well here. So on terms of rents, we have a system of national rent control which has replaced the rent pressure zones across all of Ireland. And these national rent control rules apply to private tenancies and student-specific accommodation, again, for tenancies created from the 1st of March. At a high level, it's broadly similar to what was there previously, in the sense that rent generally can only be increased once per annum by 2% pro rata or by the relevant inflation measure. And it's the lower of the two, and the inflation measure is now the CPI. But there is this concept of market rent resets that has been introduced, and that is dependent on when the tenancy began, and I'll come on to that now. So setting rent to the market is permitted to a market rate, if you like, is permitted in certain circumstances. In a private tenancy that's been created from the 1st of March, a landlord is entitled to set rent again at a market rate, but it's very much dependent on how the previous tenancy ended. If the previous tenancy was ended by the tenant, it's permitted. If the previous tenancy was ended by the landlord due to a breach of the tenant's obligations, or because the dwelling was no longer suited to the accommodation needs of the tenant, in those three instances, a landlord is entitled to set rent again at a market rate. A landlord can also set rent again at a market rate at the end of this 6-year tenancy cycle. So that assumes the tenancy is ongoing, remains in place for a long number of years. And again, the earliest this could arise is in 2032. And as you move into the next cycle, if you like, a landlord is entitled to set rent again at a market rate. For tenancies already in place prior to the 1st of March, this concept of the market rent reset that I've outlined above there isn't in place. There were and still remain existing exemptions to the rent rules that are in place. That's around primarily substantial change. So if there's a substantial change to the nature of the dwelling, there was and remains a potential to set rent again to a market rate. But these other more widely available options above are not available to landlords for tenancies that are in place prior to the 1st of March. There's some complexity in terms of the rules as well for different cases. So for new apartments or student-specific accommodation where the construction commenced from the 10th of June last year, the rules are slightly different. There's no cap on the annual increase that may be permitted. So whereas I mentioned on the previous slide, it's the relevant inflation measure or 2% per annum pro rata, the lower of the two. For this specific cohort of dwellings, there's no cap. If the CPI happened to be 3% or 4%, etc., that would be permissible. Student-specific accommodation, there's a specific provision about market rent resets, and it's prescribed to once every 3 years. It's not year to year, even if a tenant ends the tenancy or moves out, etc. It's just there's a 3-year block of time, and every 3 years the option will open up for those specific class of tenancies. And as you may know, for approved housing bodies and cost rental tenancies, these rules do not apply. There's a different set of rules for those specific tenancy types. This is an overview table that's available on the RTB website. I won't go through it again because it's just reiterating what I've said, but it's a good summary because it is a complex suite of measures overall, but it just outlines the different scenarios and whether or not a market rent reset is or isn't allowed. So again, if you get a chance to review that on the website, you may find that useful. Just in terms of a practical guide now, if you're going about setting rent, when we say rent setting and rent review, what we mean is rent setting at the commencement of a new tenancy and rent review within an ongoing tenancy. So in practice, there are really 5 steps to follow when you're setting rent at the start of a new tenancy. A landlord or someone acting on behalf of the landlord is checking the relevant rule that applies. Is a market rent reset allowed or not? Again, depending on how the last tenancy ended. If it's applicable, then you'll use the RTB rent calculator, and I'll show you that in a little while. That's a version of what was the rent pressure zone calculator. So again, this assumes a market rent reset isn't allowed, so you're calculating the maximum increase that is allowed, and the calculator on the RTB website will help you with that. You're then using this new tool, which again, I can show you in a little while, the RTB rent register to find comparables. So people, I'm sure have heard by now that when you're setting or reviewing rent, there is an obligation now to find 3 comparables, and it's with reference to the RTB's rent register. You can download a rent setting notice from the RTB website. Again, I'll show you the website in a little while. The rent setting notice is a prescribed form, and it must be completed and sent to the tenant and the RTB at the commencement of the tenancy. And that's available on the RTB website. And then, of course, that tenancy is registered as normal within 1 month of the tenancy commencing. It's a new requirement that the notice be sent to the RTB. There was always an obligation on a landlord to give a tenant some information at the commencement of a new tenancy on how the last rent was set. But it's now in this prescribed form, this rent setting notice, as I said, that's served to the tenant and the RTB at the commencement of a new tenancy. In terms of checking which rules apply for your scenario, so I've outlined a couple of scenarios earlier when a landlord may set rent at a market rate, but to also mention if the property is brand new, sorry, I'll come on to that in a moment. I'm just dealing with the opposite scenario initially. If the property was rented in the past 2 years, and the previous tenancy was ended through what's been referred to as a no-fault termination. The rent is then set under the national rent control rules. So, there are termination reasons that I mentioned earlier, things like selling or moving back in, etc. Under the various scenarios, assuming that's permitted, then the new rent must be set in line with the inflation measure capped at 2% per annum. If it's brand new to the market, so if it's a brand new property, or if it has not been subject to a tenancy in the past 2 years, or that's 12 months for a protected structure, if the tenant ended the previous tenancy, or if the landlord ended the previous tenancy for those two grounds, a landlord can be set to market rent. So just to kind of reiterate that and emphasize it, a rent can be set to market rate if it's brand new, a brand new dwelling, hasn't been rented in the past 2 years, the tenant ended the previous tenancy, or the landlord ended the previous tenancy for those two grounds specifically. A market rent reset then is permitted. If there was a previous tenancy in place, you're using the RTB rent calculator to calculate the maximum rent that's permissible. Again, sorry, I won't keep reiterating it. I'm sure you know it's the 2% per annum. The calculator is available on the website, and you can print that out as a PDF once you've done your calculation, and that's attached or clipped on to the rent setting notice. Using the rent register, this is a new tool that's available on the website, and I can show you that shortly if you'd like. A landlord must use information from the RTB's rent register to confirm that rent setting is not above market rent. It's always been the case, and it remains the case, that any rent setting of any description cannot be above what's deemed to be a market rent. And that's now with reference to the RTB's rent register. A landlord must provide 3 examples from the rent register, and these are of rents paid recently for similar properties in a comparable area. These comparables are required for rent setting notices and rent review notices. In other words, for a new tenancy commencing, when you're setting the rent at the very start, or for a rent review within a tenancy, you're still required to provide these 3 comparables in both scenarios. The rent register is based on local electoral area, on dwelling type, apartment or house, number of bedrooms, the floor area, and the BER rating, the energy rating. The rent register will currently it returns up to 30 results, and you need to select 3 comparables. Again, I'll show you the register in a few moments, but it's not a requirement to select, for example, the top 3. There's no direction in terms of which of the 30 you select. It's the 3 that you feel are most comparable and most appropriate. And the registered tenancy number is there, and that RT number and the rent paid for the examples you've selected are entered onto the rent setting or rent review notice, and the results can be downloaded. Just keeping an eye on the time here, sorry. So setting the rent to market is allowed for new tenancies if no tenancy existed in the past 2 years. I've mentioned that. You still must use the rent register to get the comparables and provide the notice of rent setting to the tenant and the RTB. Reviewing rent, it's very similar, but just to kind of differentiate it somewhat, there's something else to be aware of for landlords when a tenancy is ongoing. It's really unlikely that you'll be setting rent again to market. You'll be setting rent with the national rent control rules unless there's been a substantial change within that tenancy. And again, that's probably would have required the tenancy itself to be terminated. So more than likely, it will always be the national rent control rules that will be applicable for reviews within a tenancy. And it's that inflation measure, or 2% per annum. And there's the potential to reset if that tenancy is long running and it reaches the end of its tenancy of minimum duration after 6 years. The steps are very broadly similar that a landlord will follow. You will be using the rent calculator. You won't need to check which rules apply. You'll know that it's the calculator to calculate the maximum increase, the rent register to find the 3 comparables. You can download the rent review notice. There's 2 different notices on our website, which will show you a rent setting and a rent review. you'll download and complete that form, send it to the tenant and the RTB. And it's important to ensure when you're reviewing rent that the notice is served to the tenant at least 90 days before the new rent itself takes effect. And then you do need to update the rent register with the new rent amount. We strongly encourage, well, it's a legal obligation. Landlords must do that. Sometimes landlords will feel they'll wait till an annual renewal comes around to update the record, but it's important to update records during the year of rent changes so that it's accurate. And just lastly, one or two scenarios just to kind of put a bit of flesh on some of that information. And then if we've time, I'll take you through one or two demos. So in this example, if we imagine a tenancy, it's a private tenancy, and in October of last year, a tenant had served a notice because they wanted to move out, they bought their own property, and that tenancy itself ended in February 2026. The landlord wants to rent the property out again and is in a position to do so in March 2026. In that scenario, the landlord can set the rent to market rate. As I said, it's the tenant that ended the previous tenancy. So the landlord uses the rent register to find three comparables. When they rent the property out, they complete the rent setting form for the new tenancy. They include their comparables on the rent setting form. They print that out and they submit it to the tenant and the RTB. So again, I know it's probably sounds very straightforward, but it's just to make that clear. And in another example, where a landlord cannot reset to market, just to show you, if we imagine in November 2025, the landlord ended a tenancy because they were planning to sell. However, that sale or potential sale fell through. And so the landlord offered the property back to the previous tenants. However, they had moved on, they had a new dwelling and didn't want to return to the property. So the landlord relets the dwelling in March 2026. They're in a position to do so. But in that scenario, they cannot reset rent to market because the previous tenancy ended due to sale or attempted sale. So they're setting rent in line with the national rent control rules. And again, they're using the rent calculator that will calculate the maximum increase permitted. And they're using the rent register to find the three comparables. Then the landlord will be permitted to carry out annual rent reviews going forward from 2027. And if that tenancy happens to remain in place, it's long running, they'll get an opportunity to reset to market in 2032 if it remains in place. And that scenario would be equally applicable if the property happened to be sold and the new owner was the new landlord. The same rules would apply to that new owner. Hopefully that was useful. And what I may do now is just show you a couple of the new materials and tools before we get into any questions people have. So just bear with me one moment. So I'll just show you initially on the RTB's website, and you may have seen this, some of the key resources we have. So under resources in the rent reviews resources section, these notices are here and they can be downloaded. As I said, the notice of rent review, and this incorporates as well if there's an exemption. So in other words, if you feel you're entitled to a market rent reset, that can be captured on this form as well. So that's a review for an ongoing tenancy. It's a checklist, and it's self-explanatory once you move through it. And just to show you, there's a separate form for rent setting at the commencement of a new tenancy. And again, it's part D on this form that outlines if there's an exemption. So for example, I'll just show you briefly why do you believe these particular rules don't apply in this scenario? And there's various options there. And you or the landlord would tick the one that's relevant. That's on the rent review side of things. In terms of ending a tenancy, there's a suite of materials as well for ending a tenancy. And what we've tried to do is categorize the notices of termination by type or reason. So you'll see sample notices of termination. So that's the first one, is if the tenant is ending the tenancy, but as you scroll down, you'll see the different scenarios. There's a lot of documents under each scenario, but that's really because we've tried to provide a guide for each scenario. So a Word document that just outlines, a bit of detail on that particular tenancy termination type. and things to bear in mind. And then also we've tried to provide sample notices for each scenario. So whether the tenancy started before or after the 1st of March, whether it's a requirement to consider if the landlord is a small landlord or a joint landlord, etc. So it may appear there's lots and lots of documents for each tenancy termination type, but it's really, you would obviously select the one that's applicable to your scenario. So there's a guidance note and then a template, and if required, a statutory declaration as well that people will be familiar to. That was an existing obligation. So that's under resources on the notices of termination. On the rent calculator side, so this has replaced the rent pressure zone calculator, which people were probably familiar with, and it's very straightforward. There's a question to capture whether it was a accommodation that was a construction that was commenced on or after that date I mentioned in June. That's just really so that the correct rule gets applied. It won't be applicable in most scenarios. And then it's very straightforward from that point. The calculator will know whether it's the inflation measure, the CPI, or whether it's the pro rata 2% per annum increase that gets applied, and it will apply the correct one. So just to input a random example, I'll show you input. That warning's popping up there actually because I've selected a date only 6 months apart. That is permissible if it's a new tenancy. If one tenancy ends and a new one commences, and only 5 months has passed, you are entitled to set the rent at the commencement of a new tenancy, but it will be pro rata and it will be a lesser amount permitted. I'll just try and find one where it's in excess of 12 months so the warning won't pop up. But and then you get a results summary below, which can be printed as a PDF. And as I said, it will apply the relevant percentage change. In this instance, CPI between that period of time is 5.6, but it's applying the 2% cap applied, yes, because it's the lower of the two. What is new is the rent register. I'm sure people have looked at this at this stage. We've tried to enhance and improve the register as we move along and as it's come into existence and change or improve the messaging. So just to quickly initially show you the information at the bottom of the page before I maybe run an example. So as you scroll down, you'll see that there's questions and information on how the register is put together and what results it displays and how it displays the results. So I won't read through all of it, but it is matched by local electoral area. You get 30 returns. It tries to group the exact matches first. And then it will show weaker matches if there are not enough exact matches. And you can scroll through it and read the information there when you get a chance to, just if you do want some more detail on how exactly some of these results are being pulled together. One common question we're getting, and just to show there's a little bit of information there on it, is if a landlord feels none of the 30 returns are relevant comparables. It is permissible to use information from another source, but a landlord does need to always have 3 comparables included on the rent setting or rent review form from this register. And if you're taking in additional information, it needs to be done obviously carefully, and a landlord needs to retain all records and be able to stand over that in case it's ever queried, as to why they felt none of the returns were relevant and that they felt the market rate for that dwelling at that time was above all of the comparables. So in short, it's possible, but a landlord just does need to proceed carefully and ensure they have adequate records and information to support any kind of rent that's set above all of the rent register returns. So I'm just trying to find one to show you what it may look like. So some information is pre-populated, the local authority and local electoral area. You'll select the dwelling type, house or apartment, the BER rating, the number of bedrooms and the floor space in meters squared. And then the API will call 30 returns, and this can be printed as a PDF. Again, we've tried to enhance some of the information available. So if you had used this previously, you may notice that there's some additional information. We've clarified the tenancy start date for each return, the application type, as in, is it a brand new tenancy or an annual renewal? And you'll see there you're also getting returned the bed spaces, the registered rent per month, and the local electoral district as well. You'll notice some variation in the rent levels, and of course, I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, but different properties will have had a different kind of life cycle or a different kind of history in terms of rent regulation. We've had rent pressure zones in Dublin anyway since 2016, and depending on when that dwelling was built, when it arrived on the market, etc., it will have been subject or not subject to the previous rent regulations for a shorter or a longer period of time, and that will have impacted, of course, the rent level that ends up being set on a tenancy. And as we move further and further post the rent regulations having taken effect, you will see rents that are some variation. In other words, was a dwelling. So, for example, I'm just looking at this top one. It's a tenancy start date of June 2026. We don't know, but for example, it may have been permissible for this one to have been set to a market rate. And there could be other returns that are popping up that haven't yet reset to a market rate. So that will account for some of the variation you may see there. And sorry, I'll wrap it up very shortly now. I'm sure people want to ask questions. But just to show you the service centre I mentioned earlier for submitting documents electronically to the RTB. Once you have an account, you'll be familiar with this homepage, and you can submit a dispute case, but you can also now submit notices or documents to the RTB. This is just a testing site at the moment. So when you go in here, you'll see you have the option to submit a rent setting notice, rent review notice, or a tenancy termination notice, and you click on the relevant tile. And once you go through here, you'll see a number of drop downs and information that it's requested here. It's all fairly self-explanatory. There's an error code lookup, and you'll select the relevant tenancy type. And as you scroll down, once you put the error code lookup in there, the address will populate below, and you'll enter the required information. And there's an option to drag and drop or upload documents, and then you can save it, and it will be there. Tick box confirmation. And then once you submit, you can save it as a draft if you need to come back to it, or you can submit it to us. That's the rent setting notice, and the other ones are very similar. Same principle, same idea. You're populating the information and you're attaching the relevant documents before you submit it to us. Once you've submitted a notice, you can review it if you like, and if you've submitted multiple notices or you've submitted at different periods of time, different notices, you can review them via your records, notices submitted, and they will be visible here under whether they were rent review, rent setting, or termination notices. Your previous notices submitted will all be visible there. Hopefully that's been useful, and what I may do now is I'll stop sharing, and we'll just check with others if they have any comments or questions. Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. Both the presentation and the demos were very informative, very useful. We do have a few questions. Some of the questions I think may have been covered in the presentation, but I'll just address a few of them. Just unless Sinead or Connor have anything to add before we go into the questions, or are we okay to go straight in?
No, we're happy to go straight in.
Okay. Just also to say, I believe I'm not sure that the chat was accessible to everybody, so apologies if you were unable to submit questions. But as Gary demonstrated there is a lot of resources on the RTB website. So hopefully, if you go on there, you will be able to find the answers if you have any questions that don't get addressed. But I'll just kick off here with one, a very, I suppose, very particular, specific scenario. Someone is wondering if a parent was to pass away within the 6-year rental period, would their children have the right to give the current tenants notice to vacate? earlier, then they would typically have had to end the tenancy if they're inheriting, I suppose, the parents' estate.
I suppose it
Yes.
depends on who inherits it. Gary can probably talk through it in greater detail there, but it's whether the inheritors are the people that now own the property or large or small landlords.
Okay, so the different rules would apply depending on those individuals
But
and
small
their
landlords can
circumstances in
sell
turn.
to avoid financial hardship, and one of the defined scenarios is to repay a fair deal debt. So, assuming that the potentially children that inherit the property don't have four or more properties elsewhere, then they would be able during the 6-year tenancy to sell if there was a fair deal debt to be repaid. Is there anything you'd add to that, Gary?
No, no, I agree, Sinead. Yeah, just the general idea that if they're stepping into the shoes, assuming there's no legal difficulty just in terms of the probate, etc., that side of it. If from a tenancy termination point of view, if you like, it's the same principles and the same rules, and whether or not, yeah, the law allows for that scenario, and it may well if they're discharging a debt or moving in, etc. Yeah.
So if it's a case where the child or the person inheriting the property is a landlord and is a large landlord, has more than four other tenancies, in that case, then they would not, I suppose, be able to end the tenancy early. Is that is
No, they
right?
may not know unless, for example, I think I'd mentioned, if the tenant was in breach of their obligations or the dwelling wasn't suitable to their needs,
Okay.
or the tenant themselves ended it. But under the normal course, if any large landlord, I suppose, however they arrived at being in that position, so to speak, they may not be able to terminate that tenancy. No, that's certainly possible.
It really just depends on the circumstances of the new landlord, whoever that may be. Okay, so hopefully that clears things up for the person who asked that question. We have a couple of questions here, kind of around the rent register, maybe the comparables. Somebody is asking if there are no comparables available in the rent range that the rent pressure zone allows. Can we supply them from Daft as before? So I'm taking that to mean if no results are returned.
I think there's probably a few things to say there on that. First of all, as Gary highlighted on the page, there is guidance under the rent register on all of these different scenarios. So if you don't find what you feel is an appropriate comparable from the same local electoral area as where the tenancy is located, you are allowed to also run alternative searches for other comparable areas and to look at those as well. So that's probably the first thing you might do is look at a different but also comparable area. That's one thing that you could do. And then it does also cover that you can introduce different sources of evidence to support your rent setting, but it doesn't negate the need to provide 3 examples from the rent register in the notice of rent setting and the rent review. So if you're setting something higher than that, then the examples that you could find, you would have to have, as Gary said, very carefully documented what, the evidence you have to support that decision that you've made, that this is what represents market rent.
Okay, so essentially, I suppose the you have to have three comparables. And if you basically have to get the nearest the closest comparable that you can find, and if it's not as straightforward, search there is resources there, which is good to know that will kind of guide you through it, and how you kind of work through those alternate situations, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think previously that guidance I think was quite far down the web page, so people were maybe not seeing it. So we've added links to it at the top of the page now, and I think those scenarios and how to work around them, the guidance there is quite complete in terms of what you're able to do and not able to do. So we'd encourage people to have a read of the guidance there, and hopefully it should answer any questions you have. And also the FAQ section in the page with the overview of the changes from the 1st of March covers some of those rent setting questions and scenarios as well.
Okay. There's another question there is asking, do we have to supply all 30 comparables? So that I suppose is the 30 results that are returned. Do they have to be supplied to the tenants, all 30 of them, with the rent review or the setting of rent, or is it just the three comparables that the landlord or the letting agent selects?
The rent setting and review notice require you to insert the RT number for 3 tenancies and the rent paid for that. It doesn't, as far as I'm aware, Gary, require you to attach a copy of the printout, although you would need to keep a copy for your records. Unlike the rent calculator, where you are required to attach a copy of the rent calculation with the notice.
Yeah.
There's a question here, and again, I feel you may have kind of covered it, Gary, but I suppose no harm just clarifying again in terms of a new tenancy property that has never been let before. Someone here is asking, do we need to submit a setting rent form along with the comparable properties to justify the proposed rent price?
Yeah, you do for every rent setting now, you do need to complete this either the rent setting notice, and it does have to include the 3 comparables. So I mean, yes is the short answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And further
Um,
to that, Marion, as well,
yeah.
with the rent reviews, we've had people saying like the rent hasn't changed.
Okay.
It's just to be clear, it's every rent setting at the start of a tenancy, every rent review, regardless, it needs to be completed. I think, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Important point. It's not
And
just
sent
a
to the
change of
RTB
rent.
in
It is.
every scenario. Yeah.
But it's not too many questions here left. Somebody's asking, can the expert valuation be done by us, or does it have to be independent to us? And sorry, I don't know if the question is coming from, is it do by us, do they mean the letting agent? And do they need to get an independent letting agent if they need an expert valuation?
I don't think that's prescribed, as far as I know. But I mean, I suppose it's whatever you feel is appropriate to. If you're bringing in additional information, I suppose that the perspective to start maybe is like if there was a dispute down the line, or if there was a difficulty, or if this was ever challenged, what would be the strongest and the most relevant information. So I suppose it's somewhat of a judgment call. I mean, you may take the view, look, it would be better to have someone that wasn't the direct letting agent to provide the valuation, but it's really not prescribed. But again, the more information, the more documentation that's available, the better, I suppose. So I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Sinead, but that's probably all.
Yeah, no, the advice
Yeah.
isn't, as you said, it's not that detailed, other than that you can introduce other sources, including expert valuations.
Okay. And again, I think this is the final question I have here, unless any more have come up in since. Um, Someone's asking what, and again, I think you may have covered this, but what logic is used when resetting a rent? How are the criteria rated? Is it one, the size, two, three bed spaces, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, if the primary matching is initially the local electoral area, so it has to be within the local electoral area you input. Now, notwithstanding what Sinead mentioned earlier, that if you're very stuck and you're trying to find a comparable local electoral area or something, and then it will look at the number of bed spaces. So what it deems to be an exact match is if the number of bed spaces are exact, if the dwelling type is it a house or an apartment, obviously the local electoral area, if the BER is an exact match, and if the floor area is within 10% either direction, they're deemed to be exact matches. And then they're ranked based on tenancy start date, with the most recent tenancy showing up first on the list, as it were. No obligation to select that first one. So they're matched, and then weaker matches will appear as you move down the list. If there's 30 quote unquote exact matches, you will only receive exact matches. And it just depends on how many registered tenancies within that local electoral area meet your particular search, if you like. Um,
And is it, Gary, are the exact matches, is it clear they're exact matches on the register? No, I suppose.
I know, actually, Sinead, you may know this. I know at one point we
Yeah, I
did
think
have
if
the
you
matching score, but I don't think that's up there anymore.
there is an explanation of how they're sorted, but you will see yourself that in most cases, if you're searching in an urban area, you will only be looking at properties where the number of bedrooms is an exact match and the floor area is within the 10% range of the property that you're looking at. And you'll see a range of BER scores within that. But if you're looking at a rural area, it's really only in those areas where there's a very small number of results returned that you'll start to see maybe you're setting rent for a property with 3 bedrooms and you're going to start seeing 2 and 4 beds. That it would be in, I suppose it would be rarer to find that it's moved on to less than exact matches. And within that, then I suppose of those 30, and this is something people ask, does it have to be an average? No, it doesn't. Do I have to take the top 3 results from the 30 that I see there? No, you don't. That's why additional information has been added on the rent register columns to help you find what's the most appropriate comparison. So within the electoral area, there are also electoral districts, and the names of those are given so you can get a better sense of where within the local electoral area the tenancy is located. You can see if it was a new registration. So maybe the newer one feels more relevant to you, or the BER rating is more relevant or closer. So that additional information is just to help you judge which is the best out of the 30 to select. And I suppose it's just to document, understand your rationale, because if you opt for one out of the 30, at some point you may be required, as Gary said, in the case of a dispute or
Justify
an
that.
investigation, to explain why you selected that over others. So it's that rationale that has to be available.
Okay, great. There are a few more questions coming in, but I think we probably only have time for one more. I suppose this is a very specific question, but when we are allowed to reset the rent or set rent for the first time using the rent register to provide details of the three comparable properties, if those three comparable are charging 2,100, 2,000, sorry, euro, 2,100 or 2,200 euro, what is the maximum amount that you can then charge or for rent in that scenario? Is it the highest of the three or is it the average of the three?
So no, it's never an average. It's you just take 3 examples and you're not limited by the example that you find, because as Gary has said, if you find the examples aren't correct, you can introduce other evidence as well to support a rent setting that's above that. But you do have to give the rent registers or results that they're your primary consideration when you're looking at it. And if you go above it, you have to be able to justify why you have done that.
Okay, so it's not, I suppose, set in stone in that scenario. You have those three rents that you're looking at, but there's no specific black and white formula that you apply and to determine the rent that you will charge.
Exactly. And it
You
may be
will
that you
be
get
looking at
results your property is an A-rated property and you can only
yes.
find results for C. Like I think it's very difficult for us to answer based on the
Essentially,
different scenarios that you could encounter. But I think the main thing is that people have to understand that they have to give the 3 examples. And if you're going beyond that, you need to be able to have evidence and a clear explanation for why, in the case of an investigation or a dispute about it.
so it's about justifying the rent that you're charging and that it is proportionate, that it is um, appropriate. And as part of that is the three comparables, but it's the
Exactly. When they go into the rent
information
setting
can be
notice, you'll see they certify that in the landlord's opinion, they believe the rent setting is not above market rent. So
right. Okay. Okay. I think that is all we have time for, but I would just like to thank Gary and Sinead and Connor for joining us. Obviously, it is such a relevant topic to our licensees, particularly the 80% of our licensees that are actually licensed to provide letting services. It's great to have you here and again, and just to highlight to everyone on the call, again, all those resources that Gary shared. Any questions? I think that is your first port of call. I'd be right in saying that, Sinead. I think, wouldn't I? That's
Yeah, we always give the website a good plug. And just to say thank you for having us, and we really appreciate the commitment of everyone on the call to actually attending these webinars, ensuring you understand how to stay compliant with the changes to rental law, and that through the PSRA, if there are kind of other common question areas or things that we could provide a bit more content on the website on, we're always happy to take that feedback on board. And we've been adding to the FAQ on the website continually following the webinars. There are things like what happens when tenants change in a house share and what rent rules apply in those scenarios. We've added content on some of those common questions that we saw coming up initially after the changes were introduced in the 1st of March, and we're always happy to keep doing that.
great. And if we get any feedback, I suppose through the PSRA, we'll obviously be engaging with you, as we do on an ongoing basis anyway. So yes, and anything that, if there's any kind of recurring things that are coming up and that maybe aren't addressed, we'll certainly be sharing them with the RTB. So I think
Great.
that's
Thank
it.
you
I
very
think we
much.
can wrap up. And okay, thanks
That's
everyone.
great. See you, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.